many connections between the presentations that we heard so far, and some of the connections that I certainly heard were what was the internet? What do we want it to be? Is it something are there elements that we want to return to? How do we translate some of this kind of algorithmic sorting? What is the language that we use for that? Is there a value in the use of metaphors? If there is, what are the limitations? What are the problems? What are the potential fallouts? What does the exposing do? Matthew talked about this. And I think very usefully the ambiguity of language and the way that may open up space for further discussion and discussions around the uncanny and the unheimlich. And then the final presentation very much kind of introduced issues around ownership and the flow of international capital, which is tied up in a lot of this, of course, as well. So Matthew, you kind of sketched out a really interesting, I think, kind of both critique and possibility for opening up some of these spaces. I mean, could you say something more about how we might concretely start doing some of that work? Because I think there is something about kind of trying to make some of these spaces legible and navigable and so on. But where do you see this kind of, I mean, similar to what Joanne said about, you made a statement about where you would like the internet to go in a way. I mean, do you have similar things that you would like to see happen?
Well, yeah, it's just kind of hard to go back to. I sort of went through that in my slideshow. But concretely, I guess I would like to see less analogies to ghosts and demons and angels and black magic and white magic. And but maybe it's just a cultural thing. Maybe I'm just not part of that. I'm not grounded in that literature. For me, it just seems kind of misses the possibility of kind of embracing actually the magic that already exists within these systems, that they're kind of quirky fringes. And there is a lot of practitioners kind of working in that field, but they're not necessarily the most well-known practitioners. A lot of them are just coders that have a lot of spare time on their hands, and then they start playing around with their tools and doing kind of the more weird things. And I think that's a really fertile ground. So I think a lot of it will just be about, I guess, experimenting in that field.
Have we got some questions from the audience now? No? Are there any further things that the other speakers might want to pick up on in terms of, I mean, Joanne, you talked about, how would you like to see maybe both a return and an opening up to, what is currently lacking or what you see as certain issues. And one thing you picked up on is, anonymity is not just about trolling, which also on the hashtag people picked up on and responded to. Is that something you would like to say a little bit more about?
Yeah, I know I had a lot of random thoughts, which I think, again, I tried to articulate that this is a really difficult time to see into the future, because it feels, if anything, like we've finally reached a point where a lot of the enthusiasm for this tool is like, we're well past that point, and most people are very cynical about where things are going. And so just building another tool is clearly not the solution. And I think that's why I don't see this as nostalgia. I see it as there are aspects that we want to preserve, that are shared values, that are public trusts, and without even just honoring them as valuable contributions to just society, they're likely to change and transform and be outside of our control. I think I organized a panel at IBM a few weeks ago, and it was on that. I wanted to switch the conversation around because, like I said very briefly, I think a lot of the conversation about privacy is just misguided in terms of that this isn't the word we want to use. I think the word we want to use is consent. And I think as like the idea of a user consenting to do something, if that's like a guiding principle, that if there's a disjuncture between what I expected from my experience of this technology, if there's a disjuncture between that and what actually happened, like data leaked or things that were buttons I didn't mean to click or things like that, that I see that as that is the fault of the developer. It's not my fault because I didn't know. And there's a really excellent piece that I'm always encouraging people to read because I feel like it spells this out very well. It's by Betsy Habel for Model View Culture. It's called Consent and the User, I believe. The consent and the manipulative user. It's just going through the idea of that internet culture already. When you have things like newsletters that obscure the unsubscribe button, that's trickery. That's not cool. That's something that I just want to. I think culturally we should be looking at that and stigmatizing that behavior of exploiting users rather than looking at the average user as ignorant or, these are the wizards, we're the regular people. That rather than, hey, why are you doing these awful things?
Yes.
Like, why are you exploiting people?
So the wizards are getting a little bit of a beating here. To my left, I see a question here from the audience. Yes.
On the comment on privacy, first I'd like to invite you to read on the different dimensions of privacy and not be caught in the legalistic definitions of privacy that do not work for anyone and that are closer to data protection than a holistic view on what privacy might mean in the 21st century. But second, on whether privacy could be substituted by consent. Would we allow someone to drive at 200 miles per hour if they wanted to? No, we wouldn't, because that has consequences for the wider world and puts other people's safety at risk. So there's no question that we may have to rethink privacy, but you cannot substitute privacy for consent.
I mean, a lot of the conversation in the media right now is using the term privacy when what we're talking about is consent. So for example, the celebrity photo hack, that was like what most of our conversation was about. We're looking at it like, oh, this is a breach in privacy, we need encryption, blah, 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 blah. But and these are all valid points because it's a multifaceted issue. Like this is when we're talking about the internet, we're always talking about interdisciplinary stuff. We're always talking about it's the intersection of storytelling and encryption and blah, because it's the internet. This is what it is. It's just a whole bunch of things. But I think very valid is if someone is turning on their computer, thinking they're doing something, and it's been designed to trick a user. It's been designed expecting a user to be very ignorant of clicking a button that means I'm going to get all this spam from you for the rest of my life and you're never going to let me go. Like that's just manipulative behavior. So I agree. I think of course I think that privacy is a valid discussion. I think that a lot of our frustration about narratives right now in certain contemporary discourse about technology could perhaps start with just the value that these aren't ignorant people, they were manipulated. I'm sorry, if that makes sense.
It should be part of a longer discussion, but I don't think that consent exists in a patriarchal society. And I think that part of the feminist debate on consent is misguided because it assumes that when you consent to something, you do it freely, and I would question that.
Thank you. I would like to return to the wizards for a moment and analogs and metaphors and invite Paolo maybe to kind of comment on the fact that in what you described, which is essentially an exposure of capital and issues around copyright and ownership and so on, I felt, at least where I didn't hear it, that there was an absence of this kind of language. And so it's a sort of showing of something in a very different way. I mean, could you say something more about the way you've conceptualized, the way you frame it, the way you've visualized it?
I didn't show other projects that were like more about privacy actually, but pretty much they all like trigger kind of reactions that are these sort like media and personal, and the personal ones are always the most interesting. I think just that is there is always a degree of serendipity when you try to engage such a huge amount of people or entities in your work, or like information in general that happens, whatever you are doing. It's just like going to be in a really crowded square and do something weird and strange, and you will always have someone come up and say something to you, right? So that's the kind of degree of weirdness that I find on internet when I have these performances, yes. And and regarding consent is, I think, it's like way more complex, the issue, especially because nowadays, when we started to use internet, we were like, a bunch of kids. Now there are like billions of people out there, any type of weirdos, serious weird, dangerous weirdos. So, you have also really to balance between privacy, social accountability, and so on. So there are like an entire new framework of, policies, behavior that we need to learn, and everyone will have to learn, I think.
I wonder if I might bring Matthew in on this, because you also made a point of, thinking through unintended consequences and the kind of imagining and mapping out unintended consequences, because, Joanne, what you just mentioned seemed to speak a little bit to, we know what might potentially happen, and I think some of what Matthew was trying to get at is we have no idea what might happen when we send these things out into the wild, right? And so I wonder if, we are so far behind in being able to describe and potentially imagine some of this, and so it feels a little bit like we're a little bit clutching at straws, and we're trying to pour it into a language that somehow is in some ways comforting, because at least it gives us some grip on some of this, which is so complicated. So I was just wondering if you could say something more about, how do we deal with imagining unintended consequences in this space? Because I think they're potentially incredibly severe.
I think we're sort of constructing worlds based on logics and rules that aren't particularly clear, or they might be shifting without you knowing, Google search engine might get an update from one day to the next, and you have no idea why the search results have changed. And I think it's a bit like clutching at straws and having the kind of ground beneath your feet, the foundation not quite firm. But again, this is kind of why I like Borges, because his narratives are building these worlds in which the logic isn't clear. It's the rules in which the characters have to operate isn't quite fully understood. And I think it's interesting to kind of build maybe some sort of resilience to that, rather than always trying to find a critique in the fact that it's not stable.
For Paola, the work that you did, the art, made us really see offshore companies and paywalls in a different way. It did something very powerful in the way that you told the story, so thank you for that. But there was an ethical choice in what you did, and the impression you gave is that paywalls are bad, having an offshore company is bad. You need to expose this, and you're the side of the hero, and they are the bad guys. Could you say something about the ethical choices that you make? Because, of course, for the paywall discussion, there's a few $100s flowing to your site, but these big companies would have paid out tens of thousands of dollars for advice and investigation and legal questions. Similarly, thousands and thousands of Cayman Islands companies are very worried about what's happening, including some mafia companies who know where you live. So there's all sorts of interesting things happening, isn't there, in the ethical dilemma? And my final question is, what next? What about the other big challenges in society?
Well, regarding the ethical question, it's really hard. But if you start to question that, you wouldn't do anything in this world. Especially if you want to challenge, you push boundaries, right? So I kind of gave up, not really on the ethical issues, because I always try to, be fair somehow. But on the moral part, no, I try to, not having a concern in a way. So I always like set my own limits when I publish something. In this case, I don't know. I mean, it's also art. I mean, it's also like, I don't know how, depends also how people take that seriously, And if they took that seriously, it's because it's their own problem, probably, because they are not familiar what is about an art provocation, in a way. So I feel okay. I feel fine on that. Next, I think there are there is more to point the finger to the right people rather to the mass of people in a way, because there is some responsibility that are, really for only few. So next projects are going to be more targeted in a way.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time now, but can I ask you to join me in thanking the speakers in a really provocative panel, which has raised so many complicated questions, and hopefully we can follow up with further discussion after, but thank you so much.